Hi everybody, welcome to Live Blogger. I have combined all the videos in our floating contact form series into this single video, and I hope that you will find this useful. In this video, we are basically creating this floating contact form from scratch using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. And in the end, I'll also show you how to add this contact form to your Blogger website. And I will also leave the link of the source code in the description of this video. So let's get started. Now this is how it works. We have this contact button over here, and if I click on that, we have the contact form displayed over here, and we also have some animation for these placeholders. And if I click on this name input field, we can see that the placeholder goes up and it stays over here, and we can type anything over here, and we have the same animation for all these placeholders. But if you don't have any data inside the input field, and if you go outside the input field, we can see that the placeholder goes back to the original position. But if you have any data, then it will stay there. Now for all these icons, we're going to be using Font Awesome. So let's get the CDN of Font Awesome. Just Google for Font Awesome 5 CDN and you will get this link of cdnjs.com. So let's go to the website. And I'll just copy the link of all.min.css from here. And let's click on this button called Copy Link Tag. And here I have created an empty folder called Floating Contact Form, and I just opened it with VS Code. Now let's create the necessary files over here. So first of all, let's create an HTML file. So I'll just click on New File and I'll just name it index.html. And let's create a CSS file. I'll just name it style.css. And we also need to have a JavaScript file. So I'll just name it main.js. And let's go to the index.html file. And in VS Code, you have this shortcut where you can just press exclamation and press tab. And you'll have this basic HTML5 code. And I'll also link our CSS file over here. So I'll just type link and press tab. And in the href, I'll just type style.css. And here we'll also paste the link of the Font Awesome CDN. So I'll just paste it over here. Right now, let's start with the HTML of the contact form. So inside the body, let's create a division with the class of floating contact form. Now for all these components inside the contact form, we'll create a division with the class of form container. And in that, we'll have all this content. And now for this button, we'll create a division with the class of contact icon. And in that, we will have this icon. Right here, I'm in fontawesome.com, and let's click on this button and let's go to icons. And let's search for the icon over here. So I'll just type chat. And this is the icon that we used in our design. So let's click on that. And here's the code for the icon. So I'll just click on this and I'll just paste it over here. Alright, now let's open this in our browser. So I have this extension called Live Server installed in VS Code. So you can just search for Live Server and just install it in your VS Code. And once you do that, you can just right click over here in the HTML and click on Open with Live Server. And now here we can see our design is opened in the browser. Right now let's design the form. So first of all, we have this heading over here. So inside the form container, let's create an S3. And I'll just type, "We would love to hear from you." And here we can see we have the heading. And after that, we have these input fields and this button. So for that, let's create a form. And for the action, I'll just type hash for now. Now for each of these input fields, we'll create different divisions. So let's create a division with the class of field container. Now the first thing we need to have over here is the icon. So let's go back to Font Awesome and let's search for name. And I have used this icon. So let's click on this. And I'll just copy this from here and I'll just paste it over here. And after that, we have this placeholder. Now this is basically a label. So let's type label, and this is for the name. So I'll just type name over here, and in the label I'll just type name. And here we can see we have this icon and also this label. Now let's create the input field. So let's type input, and I'll just keep the type as text. And we also need to include the ID. So let's type ID equals name. Now this ID should match this for value over here inside the label. Alright, so now here we have the icon, the label, and also the input field. Right now let's create another division. So I'll just copy this from here and I'll just paste it one more time over here. And here the next icon that we need to have is for email. So let's go back to Font Awesome and I'll just search for email. So here I'll just type email. and I think this is the icon that we used, so I'll just click on this, and let's click on this to copy this HTML, and I'll just paste it over here. And then here we have email, and I'll just change this name to email, and then for the input field I'll just change the ID to email. So here we can see we have the name and the email. Now for the message we will have a text area because we need to have multiple lines of text. So let's create one more division, and we'll just give it the same class, field container, and in that first of all we need to have the icon. So let's go back to Font Awesome, and let's search for message, and I think this is the icon that we used, so I'll just click on this, and I'll just copy this from here and paste it down here. And next we need to have the label, so I'll just type label, and it is for the message, so I'll just type message over here, and inside the label I'll just type message. And after that we need to have a text area, so let's type text area, and here for the ID I'll just type message. And then lastly we need to have the send button, so let's go outside this division and let's create an input, and we'll give it a type of submit, and for the value I'll just type send. And let's go back to our design, and here we can see all the elements are displayed over here. So I think that's it with the HTML, and I'll also link our JavaScript file over here inside the HTML. So here just before the body ends I'll just type script:/src and press tab, and here I'll just type main.js. Alright, now let's start styling this using CSS. So we have already linked our CSS file over here. So let's go to our style.css file. First of all, we will style this contact button. Now it is inside a division with a class of floating contact form, and in that we can see we have this contact icon division. So let's type floating contact form contact icon, and we'll set the position to fixed, and we'll set the bottom position to 40 pixels, and we'll set the right position to 50 pixels, and we'll also set the cursor to pointer, so that when we hover over this we have this cursor. And we'll also add some padding to this icon. So let's type padding, and we'll just set it to 16 pixels, and now we can see we have this padding for this icon. Right now let's increase the size of this icon. So the icon is basically an I tag, so if we scroll down we can see that this is an I tag, and it has this class over here for Font Awesome. So let's go back and let's type floating contact form contact icon I, and I'll just set the font size to 42 pixels, and I'll set the color of the text to 003049. Now when we hover over this icon we need to increase the size. So for that let's type floating contact form contact icon I:hover, and let's type transform scale, and I'll just set the scale to 1.1, and we'll also add a transition for smooth animation. So let's type transition all to 300 milliseconds ease, and now if you hover over this we have the size changing. Alright, now let's start with this contact form. So let's type floating contact form, and we have a division with a class of form container over here. So let's target that. So here I'll just type form container, and let's set the position of the form container to fixed, and we'll set the bottom position to 120 pixels and the right position to 50 pixels, and let's set a padding of 24 pixels top and bottom and 36 pixels left and right, and we'll also set the width to 480 pixels, and let's set the font family to Roboto, and we'll also add a box shadow. So let's type box shadow, and we'll set the values to 0 pixels, 10 pixels, 50 pixels, and RGBA 0, 0, 0 and 0.1. Now here the width that we see for this form container is more than 480 pixels, because we have set the width to 480 pixels, but we have also added some padding, so it also gets added to the width. So for that let's set the box sizing to border box. So I'll just type floating contact form asterisk. Now this will select all the elements inside the floating contact form, and here I'll just type box sizing and I'll just set it to border box, and now we can see we have the correct width. Right now let's add rounded corners. So I'll just type border radius, and we'll just set it to 24 pixels. Right now let's style this S3. So let's type floating contact form S3, and I'll just set the font size to 30 pixels, and we'll just set the color of the text to 003049, and we'll decrease the margin top a little bit. So let's type margin top, and I'll just set it to 10 pixels. Now if you go back to our original design, we can see that we have this underline over here. So for that we'll be using an after selector. Now using after and before selectors, we can add extra data to the elements. So let's type floating contact form S3 : after. Now for the after selector, we need to have a content property. So let's type content. Now if we just type 1, 2, 3 over here, we can see that after the S3 we have 1, 2, 3 displayed over here, but we don't want to have any content. So I'll just delete this from here. We just create a basic height and width and a background color. So let's type height of 3 pixels and width of, let's say, 36 pixels, and we'll set a background color of EF233C. Now we need to position the underline based on this heading. So for the heading we need to type position relative, and here in the after selector we can just type position absolute, and now we need to position it to the left and to the bottom. So let's type left of 0 and bottom of -4 pixels. So here we have the underline for our heading. Alright, now let's style the input fields. So I'll just type floating contact form input, and we'll set the type to text, and we'll also target the text area. So I'll just type floating contact form text area. Now first of all we'll set the width to 100%, and we'll also add a padding of 24 pixels top and bottom and 32 pixels left and right. And I think that's a lot, so let's decrease it to, let's say, 16 pixels, or let's say 12 pixels. Right, that looks alright. And now let's set the font size to 16 pixels, and we'll also add a border of 1 pixel solid, and we'll set the color to RGBA 047 73, and for the opacity I'll just type 0.3, and we'll also have rounded corners. So I'll just type border radius, and we'll just set it to 8 pixels, and we'll also change the color of the text inside the input fields. So I'll just type color, and we'll just set it to this dark color right here. Now when you click on these input fields, we have this outline. Now if you don't want to have this outline, you can just type floating contact form input : focus, and when we focus on the input fields, I'll just set the outline to none. And now we can see we don't have the outlines, but for the text area we have the outlines. So I'll just add that over here as well. So I'll just type floating contact form text area : focus. Right, everything works alright. Now for these input fields we'll also add a margin bottom. So let's type margin bottom, and I'll just set it to 20 pixels. Right, now let's style this placeholder and also these icons. Now if you go back to our HTML, we can see that we have a division with the class of field container, and in that we have all these elements. Now what we will do is we will set the position of this label and also this icon relative to the field container. So let's go back to our style.css file, and here I'll just type floating contact form field container, and I'll just set the position to relative. Now we need to set the position of the label and the icon to absolute. So let's type floating contact form field container label, and I'll just set the position to absolute, and also floating contact form field container I, which is the icon, and I'll just set the position to absolute. Right, now let's set the top position to, let's say, 16 pixels. I think we will just increase the padding of the input fields a little bit. So I'll just set it to 14 pixels. Right, that looks alright. And I'll just set the left position of the label to 36 pixels. And we'll just set the top position of the icon to 16 pixels. And the left position of the icon to 12 pixels. And I think we need to move the label to the right a little bit more. So I'll just set it to, let's try 40 pixels. I think that looks alright. And now we can see we have this cursor. We also need to add some more padding on the left of the input field. So let's go back to the input field, and here you can see we have set a padding of 32 pixels left and right. So we'll also set a padding left of 40 pixels, and now we can see that the cursor is in the correct place. Right now let's set the color of the icon to a lighter color. So let's type color and we'll just set it to RGBA, and we'll set the values to 0, 55, 85 and 0.8. Right now we'll decrease the height of this text area a little bit. So let's type floating contact form text area, and we'll just set the height to 150 pixels. And here we can see on the right we have an option to resize this text area. Now we'll disable the option of resize. So for that you can just type resize and set it to none. And now we can see we don't have the option of resize. Right now the last thing we need to style is this button. So let's type floating contact form input, and for the type I'll just type equals submit. And first of all I'll just set the border to none, and we'll just set the background color to the dark color, and I'll just set the color of the text to white, and let's set a padding of 16 pixels top and bottom and 32 pixels left and right, and we'll just set the width to 100%, and we'll also add a border radius of 24 pixels, and we'll set the font size to 16, and we'll set the font weight to bold, and we'll also set the cursor to pointer. So now when we hover over this we have this cursor, and we also need to change the color of this label. So let's scroll up, and here for the label I'll just type color, and I'll just set the color to the dark color. Right now the last thing we will do is we will add a hover effect for this button. So let's type floating contact form input, and type equals submit :hover, and when we hover over this button we will have a light background color. So let's type background, and I'll just set the color to 00659B, and we'll also add a transition. So I'll just type transition all to 500 milliseconds ease. And now let's hover over this button, and we can see that the hover effect is working alright. So everything is working alright. So that's it with the design of our contact form. Now what we'll do over here is that we're going to add a class to this label, and when we have that class then we're going to add this state over here. So we'll add a class called active, and when we have the active class then the label will have these styles, and if you don't have the active class then the label will have the current style. Now just for testing I'll just add a class called active to this first label over here. So I'll just type class equals active, and let's go to our style.css file, and if we scroll up we can see these are the styles for the label. So here we will type floating contact form field container label.active, and make sure that you don't have any space between label and active. Alright, first of all let's set the font size of the label to 13 pixels, and now we can see for the first label we have a font size of 13 pixels. Alright, let's set the background color to EF233C, and we'll set the color of the text to white, and we will add a padding of 2 pixels top and bottom and 16 pixels left and right. Right now let's set the top position to -8 pixels, and we'll set the left position to 16 pixels, and we'll also add a white border to the left and to the right of this label so that we have some separation between this line and this label. So I'll just type border left, and I'll just set it to 8 pixels solid and white, and I'll do the same for border right. So I'll just duplicate it, and here I'll just type border right, and I think we can move it a little bit to the right. So I'll just set this to left 20 pixels or maybe 24 pixels, but that looks alright. And we'll also set the font weight to bold. Alright, that's it with the styles for the active label, and we'll also add a transition so that we will have smooth animation between the two classes. So I'll just type all to 300 milliseconds ease. And now if we go back to our HTML, and if I just remove this active class from here, and if I add it to the second label, we can see that we have the styles for the second label. Now we're going to add and remove the classes using JavaScript. Right now the next thing we will do is we will add an active class to this form container. So let's go back to our style.css file, and by default we want to hide this contact form, and when we click on this button we need to display this contact form. So let's go to the top, and here we have the styles for the contact form. So we have these styles over here for the form container. Now by default we will add a rotation, so let's type transform, rotate Z, and we'll set the angle to -6 degrees. Now we want this element to rotate from this bottom right corner, so we have to set the transform origin to this bottom right corner. So here we'll just type transform origin, and I'll just set it to bottom right. Now we also need to hide this form container, so let's type opacity and we'll just set it to 0. And now if you hover over this area, we can see that we can still click on the input fields and even on the send button. So we also have to set the pointer events to none. So let's type pointer events none, and now we cannot click on any of these elements. And we'll also add a transition so that we will have smooth animation. I'll just set all to 500 milliseconds ease. Alright, now let's add the styles for the active class. So let's type floating contact form, form container dot active, and here we need to reset all these elements. So let's type transform, rotate Z, and I'll just set it to 0 degrees, and we'll just set the opacity back to 1 and pointer events back to auto. And now if you go back to our index.html file, and if we just add an active class over here, we can see that the contact form is displayed over here. But by default, when we don't have the active class, the contact form is not displayed. Alright, now let's add and remove the active classes using JavaScript when we click on this button over here. So we need to reference some of these elements in our JavaScript. We need to reference this form container because we need to add the active class. And we also need to reference this contact icon because when we click on this icon, we need to add the class. And then we also need to reference all these input fields from here because when we click on the input field, we want to add the active class to the label. So for all these input fields, I'll just add a class called form input. I'll just paste this in all the input fields. So I'll just paste it over here, and even for the text area. Alright, now let's reference all of these elements in our JavaScript. We have already linked our JavaScript file over here. So let's go to our main.js file, and let's type const form inputs, and I'll just set it to document.querySelectorAll, and here we'll just type floating contact form, form container, and in that we have the form input. Now since we are using querySelectorAll, we're going to get multiple form inputs, and we're going to store that inside this form inputs constant. And now let's also reference the contact button. So let's type contact, and I think it is called contact icon. So I'll just type contact icon over here equals document.querySelector, and here we'll just type floating contact form contact icon. And then lastly we need to reference the form container. So let's type const form container equals document.querySelector floating contact form form container. Now let's add an event listener to this contact icon. So let's type contact icon dot add event listener, and we will listen for the click event, and here I'll just create an arrow function. Now here we need to add and remove the active class from the form container. So let's type form container dot class list dot toggle, and here we'll just type active. Now what this does is that if you have the active class inside the form container, then it will remove it, and if you don't have the active class, then it will add it. So that's why we are using toggle over here. And I just noticed that we have a typo over here. It should be floating, and I'll just type T over here. Alright, now let's go to our design and let's click on this contact button, and we can see that our contact form is being displayed over here. Now let's click on this button once again, and we can see that the contact form disappears. So the animation for this contact icon is working alright. Now let's add the animation for these placeholders, and I just noticed that we don't have this cursor being displayed over here when we hover over this label. So let's go back to our CSS and let's go to the label, and for the label I'll just type pointer events and we'll just set it to none, and now we have the correct cursor. Alright, so let's go back to our main.js file, and here we have multiple form inputs, and we have stored them inside this constant called form inputs. and I have a typo over here. We need to have form inputs. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a for each loop, and we're going to loop through all the form inputs, and we're going to add event listeners to all of them. So let's type form inputs dot for each, and here we need to have a callback function. Now for the argument, I'll just type I for the input fields. You can name this variable anything you want, and we'll just create an arrow function over here, and here we'll just type I dot add event listener. So this will add event listeners to all the form inputs inside this constant. Now for the event, I'll just type focus, because when we click on this input field, the focus event is going to be triggered. So let's create an arrow function over here. Now we need to add the active class to the label, not to this input field. So if we go back to our index.html file, here we can see we have the input field, and before that we have this label, and it's the same with all the other input fields. Here we can see we have this input field, and the previous element is the label, and even for the text area we can see that the previous element is the label. So let's go back to our JavaScript, and we need to select the previous element of this I. So let's type I dot previous element sibling. Now this property in JavaScript will help us access the previous element. So let's type dot class list dot add, and we're going to add a class called active. So what we are doing over here is that we are accessing the previous element of the input field, and we are adding the class active to that. So let's test it out. Let's click on this input field, and now we can see we have the active class to this label, and we have the active class to all the labels. Now when we go outside this input field, we need to remove this active class from the label. So for that, I'll just copy this code from here, and I'll just paste it down here. And here instead of focus, I'll just type blur, and here instead of adding, we'll just remove the active class. And let's test it out. Let's click over here, and we can see we have the active class, and if we click somewhere else, the active class is removed from that input field. Now the last thing we need to do is when we have some data inside our input field, we need to keep the active class. So for that, we will add an if condition over here. So here, before removing the active class, we're going to add an if condition. So I'll just type if I dot value equals blank. So if the value inside the input field is blank, then we're going to remove the active class, or else we're going to keep it. So let's test it out, and let's type some value over here. And now we can see that the active class stays for the label when we have some data inside the input field. And if you don't have any data, then the active class is removed. This is the Blogger website where we're going to add the contact form. And I'm using a theme that comes by default with Blogger. So if you go back to the dashboard, and if you go over here to theme, you can see that I'm using this theme called Notable Light. So if you scroll down, we can see the theme is right here. Now let's scroll up, and let's click on this arrow and click on Edit HTML. Now the first thing we will do is we'll create a contact form widget. So let's scroll down all the way to the bottom. Now here, after this division, let's go ahead and create the widget. Now we have to create a Blogger widget inside a Blogger section. So let's create a Blogger section first. So let's type b section, and we need to have an ID for the section. So let's type ID equals, and I'll just give it an ID of contact container, and let's close the section over here. Now let's create a widget. So let's type less than b colon widget. Now for the widget, we need to have an ID and a type. So let's type ID equals, and I'll just name the ID contact form 1, and let's set the type to contact form, and let's close the widget over here. Alright, now let's click on save, and we can see that our theme is updated successfully. So let's scroll down, and here we can see Blogger has added a lot of code automatically because we added this widget with a type of contact form, and this is all the content inside the contact form. So now if we go back to our website, and if I just refresh this page, we can see we have the contact form displayed over here, and we have the name, email, message, and the button. So now the next thing we need to do is we need to copy the code from this design, and we need to add it to a Blogger template code, and we need to get some of the elements from this contact form, and we have to add it inside the code. So let me show you how to do that. Let's go back to our template code, and now here in this division with the class of contact form, I'll just make some space over here, and I'll just paste the HTML of our design over here. So let's go to the source code, and I will leave the link of the source code in the description of this video. So let's go ahead and copy this HTML from here, so everything inside the body till here, and I'll just copy this from here and let's paste it over here. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to replace all these input fields in our design with the input fields in our contact form widget. So here we have the first input field for the name, so I'll just copy this line of code from here, and let's scroll up, and here we can see we have the input field for the name, and here we also have a class called form input, so we have to add that class as well. So I'll just delete this line of code from here, and I'll just paste the line of code from the contact form widget, and now we need to add the class, so I'll just type form input over here. Alright, let's do the same with all the other input fields. So let's scroll down, and here we have the input field for the email, so I'll just copy this line of code from here, and let's scroll up, and I'll just paste it over here, and we need to add a class of form input. And then lastly we have this text area, so let's scroll down, and here we have the text area for the message, so I'll just copy this, and let's scroll up, and I'll just paste it over here, and let's also add a class over here called form input. And then lastly we have this button, so let's scroll down, and here we can see the contact form button, so I'll just copy this line of code from here, and let's scroll up and add it over here in place of this button. And now if we scroll down and go to our contact form widget, here we can see we also have a division for the error messages, so let's copy this from here as well, and let's scroll up, and I'll just add it inside the form. And now we can go ahead and delete this form, so let's go over here, and I'll just delete everything from here and also this division. Right now we have replaced all our input fields with the input fields from the widget. Now here for the for attribute inside the label we can add the ID. So if we go back to our website, and if we right click over here and click on inspect, here we can see for the ID we have contact form 1 underscore contact form name. So this first part over here is the ID of our widget, and then we have the contact form name. So I'll just copy this ID from here, and let's go back to our template code, and I'll just paste it over here inside the for attribute. Now in the same way we can do it for the email label as well, so let's delete this from here, and here instead of contact form name we can see it has contact form email, so I'll just type email over here. And here for the message we can just delete this and paste this over here, and here we can see it has contact form email message, so I'll just add that over here. Alright, that's it with the HTML of our contact form. Now let's go ahead and add the JavaScript. So I'll just make a script tag over here, and let's go back to our source code, and let's go to main.js file, and I'll just copy everything from here, and let's paste it inside the script tag. Now the next thing we will do is add the CSS. So let's go back and let's go to the style.css file, and I'll just copy all the CSS from here, and let's go back and let's scroll up and go to all the CSS. So here we can see all the CSS of the theme. Let's go to the end of the CSS, and here we will just add a comment. So here I'll just type floating contact form, and let's paste the CSS over here. Alright, now the last thing we need to add is the link of the font awesome CDN. So let's go back and let's go to the HTML, and we have used some font awesome icons. So here we can see these are font awesome icons. So if we scroll up we can see that we have added the link inside the head tag. So I'll just copy this link from here, and let's go back to the theme code, and let's go to the top of the code, and here we can see we have the head tag, so we have to paste it inside the head tag. So I'll just paste it over here, and now let's click on save. Right, now let's go back to our website and let's refresh this page, and here we can see we have the contact button, and if I click on this we have the contact form displayed over here. Now we need to fix some of these things over here. The first thing we need to have is a background color for this main container, and then we need to fix the styling of the button. And I think the font size of the labels are also a bit too large, and we also need to have some margin bottom for this S3. So if you right click over here and go to the inspect, let's make some changes. So for the S3, let's add a margin bottom, and we'll set the margin bottom to 24 pixels, and I think that looks alright. And let's go to the container division, which is form container, and let's add a background color over here. So let's type background and let's type white, and let's also decrease the size of this label. So let's select one of these labels from here. It's inside the form, and in that we have this field container, and in that we have this label. So let's set a font size of 16 pixels, and I think that looks alright. So let's add these changes to our CSS. So let's go back to our template code and let's go to the CSS, and here first of all for the form container, let's add a background color. So let's add a background color of white, and then for the S3 we had added a margin bottom. So let's type margin bottom of 24 pixels, and then for the label we need to have a font size. So let's type font size of 16 pixels, and the styling of the button was not applied. So here we can see we have this button with no styling. So let's go back and let's see what's the problem. So if we scroll down, here we can see for the button we have this selector called floating contact form input type equals submit. So let's scroll down and go to the HTML and let's see whether we have any problems. Now here we can see we have this input field for the button, but we don't have a type of submit over here. So that's why the styles of the button are not being applied. So let's copy this class from here, and I'll just add this class to the selector. So I'll just copy this from here, and let's scroll up and go to the CSS. And here instead of input type of submit, I'll just paste the class name over here. So input dot the class name, and here also we will do the same, dot class name. And now let's click on save. Alright, now let's go back to our website and let's refresh this page, and now let's click on this button, and here we can see we have this input field and everything is looking alright. And let's add some random value over here, and let's click on send, and here we can see we have this message, a valid email address is required. So we also have this form validation for our contact form. Now we need to style this as well. So let's right click over here and go to inspect, and here we can see we have this division, and we already have some inline styles over here. So it has a max width of 222, and it has all these styles over here. So let's add our own styles to this division. So I'll just close this, and let's go back to our code, and let's go to the HTML, and here we have the division. I'll just delete all this inline CSS from here, and I'll just add a class, and I'll just name it error message. And now we can style this using CSS. So let's scroll up, and here in the CSS we will add some more CSS. So here we just type floating contact form, and in that we have a division with the class of form container, and in that we have a division with a class of error message that we just added. And let's add some styles over here. We'll just add a font size of 16 pixels, and we'll just set the color of the text to a red color. So I'll just copy a color from our CSS. I'll just copy this color from here, and I'll just paste it right here, and let's save it. Now let's go back to our website and let's refresh this page, and let's click on this button, and let's add some random value over here, and let's click on send, and we can see that the font size is added but the color is not added. So let's right click and let's see whether we have any problems, and I think we have a typo over here. Let's go back, and here we can see we have 2 hashes. Now it should work. Now let's go back and refresh this page, and let's click on this button, and let's click on send, and here we can see that the styles are being applied to the error message. Now let's add some valid information over here. So I'll just type a name, and I'll just type a valid email ID, and I'll just type some message over here, and now let's click on send. And now we can see we have this message called your message was sent, and the message will be sent to the email ID that you're using for your Blogger website. Now the last thing we need to fix over here is that after sending the message, we have all these labels in the active state. It should be in a non-active state after sending the message. I'll just do it once more. So I'll just add some valid info over here, and let's click on send. And here we can see after the message is sent, we have these labels over here. It should be in the normal position. So for that, we will add a timer inside our JavaScript code, and we will check whether we have any data inside these input fields after a specific amount of time. And if you don't have any data, then we will bring back the labels to the original position. So let's go back to our theme code and let's scroll down. Now here in the JavaScript, we need to add an event listener to the button. So if you scroll up and if you go to the HTML, here we can see we have this button with the class of contact form button. So we need to reference this in our JavaScript. So let's scroll down, and here we can see we have the JavaScript. I'll just add a constant, and I'll just type contact form button equals document dot query selector, and here I'll just type floating contact form container, and in that we have contact form button. Right now let's go ahead and add an event listener. So let's type contact form button dot add event listener, and let's create an arrow function over here. Now when the contact form button is clicked, we need to set a timer. So let's type set timeout. So this is how you create timers in JavaScript, and in that we need to have two arguments. One is a function, so let's create a function over here, and the next argument is the duration. So we'll add a duration of 1 second, which is 1000 milliseconds. Now here inside this timer, we need to check whether there is any data inside the input field, and we need to remove the active class from the labels. So I'll just copy this from here, because here also we are doing almost the same thing, and I'll just paste it down here. Now here we need to remove this line of code because we are not adding event listener to these input fields. So I'll just delete this line of code from here, and also this line of code. Now what we're doing over here is that we are checking whether the contact form button is clicked. So here we need to add a click event. So I'll just type click over here. Right here we are checking whether the contact form button is clicked, and if it is clicked, then we are starting a timer for 1 second, and after 1 second all the code that is inside the timer will be executed. So what we are doing over here is that we are looping through all the input fields inside our form. If you scroll up here, we can see we are getting all the form inputs inside this constant form inputs, and we are looping through all the input fields, and then we are checking whether there is any value inside the input fields. And if there is no value inside the input field, here we are checking whether the value is blank, and if you don't have any value, then we are going to remove the active class from the previous element, which is the label. So I hope you understood this. If you don't understand any of this, you can go ahead and check out the videos where I showed you how to design this from scratch using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Then you'll be able to understand it a lot better. Right now let's go ahead and click on save. And now let's go back to our website and let's refresh this page, and let's click on this button. I think we have some problems. Let's right click over here and go to inspect. And here we can see we have an error. So let's go ahead and check what is the error. Right, here's the problem. This click should not be inside parentheses. So let's go back and let's fix that. So let's remove these parentheses from here. And here we need to add an arrow function. And we'll also increase this timing to 2 seconds so that we have more time to check. Right now let's click on save. Now let's go back to our website and let's refresh this page. And let's click on this button. And let's send a message. And let's click on send. And we can see everything works alright. After the message is sent, all the label classes have the active classes removed. So that's basically how you add a floating contact form to your Blogger website. So that's it for this video. If you have any doubts, you can ask in the comments below. And if you like this video, please click on the like button and subscribe to this channel to get the latest video updates. Thanks a lot for watching. Have a nice day.